Maybe I can. There we go. So we're glad to have you all here, and to be able to have Dr. Ashford join us, we had to do some rescheduling due to some Zoom issues and various other scheduling conflicts, but we're ready to go. Just a couple of notes for those of you who are interested in our upcoming second webinar of the spring semester. That'll be taking place in March, on March 12th. That's a Wednesday from 5 to 7 p.m. And it will be featuring Sheila Curran Bernard of the Department of History at SUNY Albany. She'll be speaking about her new book about Leadbelly, Huddie Ledbetter, the folk musician, in a talk called Challenging the Leadbelly Myth. And the new book is called Bring Judgment Day, Reclaiming Leadbelly's Truths from Jim Crow's Lies, just published last year. So make sure to register for that if you haven't yet. That's Wednesday, the 12th of March from 5 to 7 p.m. Today, we have Dr. Howard Ashford speaking with us. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Ashford in a moment. But I wanted to first just remind you that during and after Dr. Ashford's talk, you're welcome to present comments, questions on using the Q&A function of Zoom. And you can either have me ask you to unmute your microphone and you can ask your question, or you can just ask me to read it for you as moderator. My name is Michael Kramer, and I'm a historian at SUNY Brockport and the organizer of the SUNY History Lab and the SUNY History Lab webinar series in U.S. history. Hey, I think that's all the administrative things. So let me talk a little bit about our guest tonight. Our speaker is Dr. E. Howard Ashford from the Department of History at SUNY Oneonta. And he will be speaking about reframing African-American history in the post-Civil War era. Dr. Ashford is an associate professor of history at SUNY Oneonta. He holds 5 degrees, including a PhD in Afro-American Studies from University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And his first monograph, which came out in 2022, is a wonderful book titled Mississippi Zion, The Struggle for Liberation in Attala County, 1865 to 1915. It won the Mississippi Historical Society Book of the Year Award and the Anna Julia Cooper and C.L.R. James Award from the National Council for Black Studies. The book was a finalist for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History Book Prize and the Mississippi Arts and Letters Best Nonfiction Book. And it made the list for the Rodel Institute's Edwards Book Award. Dr. Ashford has published articles, book reviews. He served as a manuscript reader for a number of academic presses, and he is a recurring history consultant for Dr. Henry Louis Gates's Finding Your Roots television series. He previously worked as the historian and archivist for the Harlem River Preservation Project, and we're delighted to have him here tonight to talk about his research into reframing African-American history in the post-Civil War era. On to you, Dr. Ashford.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate those words, and to those of you that are here this evening, I hope that you enjoy the talk, and from there we can have a good discussion. So before I share my screen, my slides, I wanted to just briefly talk about what it is that I like to look at in terms of historically, and a lot of that is going back to really look at what did Black people actually do once they were free after slavery, and then what's the result of that action. Oftentimes, it's like, at least when I was in school, Black history is more so told as what was done to Black people, or it's told more that from once the war ends, roughly to 1877, that Black people had this heyday of land ownership and running for office and being elected. But once the North leaves the South, Black people just kind of go into this state of nothingness until 1963. I Have a Dream comes along, and then that's the kind of totality of Black history that we're looking at. Reconstruction, Jim Crow, we're looking at larger events to tell what happened to Black people, but we're not looking at why they exist. Why does Jim Crow exist? And I don't think that we actually get that. We don't really look at that question because we're mostly heavily looking at Reconstruction as a way to examine Black life. And that to me is not the most proper way of doing so, because we're looking at a period of no more than 12 years to examine the people that have been enslaved for hundreds of years. So that was kind of like the genesis of what I wanted to question, but also zooming in on one location and studying that location over time as a way to then address how can we go back and examine Black people and what they actually did, and then kind of retell Black history in a new way. So that's the that's what fueled my desire, was really just hearing what Black people did not do, and then wanting to tell what they did, but then what's the result of what they did. So from there, I will share my screen, and then we'll go from there. We'll do that, and let me know if you can see my slides.
Looks good.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so this talk, I will break it down into three parts. One, I will kind of go over what I just did, which is kind of re-looking at the way that history examines Black people in the once the war actually ends and they are freed, and then looking at this notion of what is power when looked at through the lens of Black people, Black power, and then I will put those two together and discuss how I discuss those like in my book, and what the book is essentially trying to argue um, or say. So the book starts off with a quote that I think is very uh, uh, poignant. And Du Bois asked a question in 1903: do we really want to know anything new about Black people, or are we comfortable with the story, the conclusions that have already been drafted, that those that have already been taught to us? Do we really want to expand our minds to really study Black people? And while he's talking about Black people in 1903, as we know that he spent a lot of his career trying to study Black people to reshape how society viewed them. I took this quote and just kind of expanded it even more to say, are we comfortable with the story that we have been told, or are we going to make ourselves uncomfortable by examining new questions or looking at new people in history that are not your Booker T. Washingtons, your Ida B. Wells, um, Du Bois, Church Terrell, et cetera, et cetera. And then what what happens when we ask the question, what did Black people do, as opposed to what was done to them, or who did what to them? Because in doing so, history does not center Black people in the heart of their own narrative. In that, we're not looking at them as the subject of the narrative. They're more so just the object to discuss something else. And therefore, when we're examining Black people post-slavery through a traditional lens of Reconstruction or Jim Crow or the 1960s movement, what we're actually doing, or so I say, is that we're flattening history by not really allowing everyday people's actions to really tell us how we get to a certain point, but rather than trying to utilize them as examples to discuss larger events. So I appreciate reading the history of Reconstruction and the many ways that it has been addressed and approached, or Jim Crow, from Woodward's work and examining what are the origins of Jim Crow to the many books that try to examine Black life under Jim Crow, or even the immense scholarship on the movement. However, though, what I think that we need to kind of re-examine is this period that we often just associate with Reconstruction and Jim Crow, to really, from a Black person's perspective, expand the time frame out so that we can adequately showcase Black power and what is its impact on the broader society. So, what I propose in Mississippi Zion is that we reshape the era. Not that we're going to say Reconstruction doesn't exist, or the deer or Jim Crow don't exist, because they do, but they do not solely they'll shape Black life. Meaning that Reconstruction was not created by Black people per se, because what were they trying to reconstruct? We know that the North was trying to reconstruct the Union, the South was trying to reconstruct the South, but for Black people, they're trying to construct a new identity, a new way in society. Thus, they're trying to liberate themselves to be truly free. And how I frame it as is this era of liberation, that is continuing today, because it is important to note that Black peoples in this country have not been free the same amount of time that they have been enslaved. So to truncate their history into short amount of times that are not necessarily dictated on their own terms, you miss a lot of the action that they are actually doing, and you you do not get a full sense of their of of their actions in terms of what is the response to it. So I break down this new era that I'm trying to introduce into larger chunks of time to kind of showcase, well, how much time is if it's an adequate amount of time to really study what Black people did, and two, what's um, uh, what's the impact. So the first stage of this era, I would say, is 1865 through roughly the start of World War One. These are the same people who were enslaved, who fought for freedom, who ran, who escaped, who broke tools, who challenged the system of slavery. These are those same people. That momentum for freedom did not stop merely because the war ends, or that we don't say cut and bring in new actors, new sets, and now we have a whole new story, and now we shift the story to larger structures as what's happening in Congress and who's passing what laws, and Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln, and those kind of broader discussions. We still need to look at the people, and looking at the power that they possess, and then what is the result of that power, from which we can then study the next part of this era. And so to do that, what I challenge also is this notion of Black power. Black power is not just a slogan, it's not just a concept, it's not a 1960s creation, but it's something that Black people had already possessed when we look at what constituted power in the period that we're going to examine. Well, coming out of slavery and even during slavery, but for the majority of Black people that were enslaved, coming out of slavery, what constituted power? And that was education, that was land, that was voting, that was working with whites who wanted to work with you, not being concerned whether or not people liked you or not, but you're going to work with those who want to work with you, and you're going to build your own spaces that are going to be more so under your control. And therefore, while there are works that do look at Black education and Black land owning and Black voting and uh, uh, race relations and how Black people built their own towns, etc., they're often looked at in a one-to-one kind of manner, that they're not really connected. And we have to connect all of these sources of power to see, one, how did Black people obtain this power, and then two, as you will hear me say, what's the result of them uh, getting said power. So Black power, and this was a source of contention when I was at UMass, was trying to push back the concept of Black power to a lived experience 100 years before the actual term as we know it today was being used. Um, and that's what happens when we flip the narrative and center it on Black people and their actions, that we actually get to see what they accumulated and what I would just argue that can be constituted as Black power. Um, so we're not just merely looking at who accomplished something. We're not looking at one or two people. We're looking at groups of people, and we're going to look at it within one location and not to spread out the examples to where we're going to cherry pick examples to make a narrative. But how do we study change over time, but looking at it in one place? And in order to do that, there are some things that I, like to tell uh, people in terms of my research, is that in order to write this type of history, one thing that people have to understand is that Black people viewed themselves differently than how white people viewed them. Black people were not sitting around thinking about what white people thought about them, and I'm using Black and white in a very generic term. So, but they had things to do that they were not living in fear. They were not concerned about what was going to happen if they did X, Y, and Z. They had things to do. And the things that they did, they framed that within the laws of the land, and especially using the Constitution to essentially say we can do whatever it is that we wish to do without permission, because it is supported by the Constitution. Therefore, by seeing themselves as citizens of the nation, that there's a psyche that we need to address, is that the fear that sometimes is attributed to Black people uh, is misdirected, because their fear was not of white individuals' response to them. The fear was not doing what they were legally uh, that's allowed to do. So by framing their existence in the Constitution, we are in a sense now going to just now examine Black life. And it doesn't have to quote unquote share the spotlight, because you can tell a narrative of Black people without necessarily having to jostle position of the narrative to constantly put a group back in the heart of the narrative that we may be more used to being there. So when we're looking at, or how I look at this time in history is that Black people had things to do, and that was going to school, owning land, voting, working with others, building, and not necessarily being concerned about what was going to happen to them. And therefore, in Mississippi Zion, it is to intervene in the post-Civil War period. And I'm really looking at that window of time that is really framed as the Reconstruction Jim Crow uh, period, and really going to dig down, and we're now going to really look at what causes Jim Crow. What's the catalyst for Jim Crow? Why does a whole system need to be created for Black people? What are they doing to necessitate that? And in order to do that, Reconstruction has to kind of be pushed into the background. It happens during this larger era for liberation, and it comes and it goes, but Black people continue to move on. So, with Attala County, which is the center of the state, the literal center of the state, the heart of the state, when trying to find a case study, which the book really is a case study that zooms in and out to kind of show how it's connected to its region, its state, the South, and the larger country. Attala County was selected, one, because I knew it very well, having lived there a lot of my life. But in the research shows that the county was race neutral. And what I mean by race neutral is that while there were more white people who lived in the county, when you break down the ages coming out of slavery, per the 1866 county census that was conducted, when you're breaking down ages like 0 to 10, 11 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 30, I think it was 30 to 39, those numbers, there was no one group that had a sizable uh, number over the other. The reason why there are more white people in the county is because there are these people are much older. So that's going to give the overall number the tilt towards it being quote unquote a white county. But once you break down the numbers in terms of the ages, it's really a county that's race neutral. And also the county's records have been preserved over time, which is lucky for me. Uh, uh, School records, the land records, people who voted, all of that stuff was essentially frozen. It had not been destroyed. It was not split apart by the white records or the Black records, and it was easy for me to get access to them. And also, it did provide the opportunity to tell a continuous story over time, and not rely on just pulling from different examples, which I think does not make as strong of a story. So, the United States is a capitalist country, nation. Slavery was a system of labor, like was a system of labor, uh, like exploitation. Who knew that best but those who were once enslaved? And therefore, to start with, coming out of slavery, what a lot of Black people did was make money. Uh, yes, a lot of people are poor, and we don't necessarily trying to put like how many, because there are as many poor whites as there are Blacks. But shifting the narrative, not all Black people are poor, because coming out of slavery, they understood that they had to have money because they were once considered a capital themselves. Therefore, who they are they are keenly aware that what it takes to succeed in this type of society is money. So when we're looking at labor contracts, which not every Black person is bound to a labor contract, labor contracts are often presented as one-sided, that many Black people did not gain from them, and that in itself is its own story and narrative. I do not deny that. Because when you look at a lot of the contracts, depending on how many people are needed to be supported, when you look at the deal that they got, they weren't good deals. However, though, there are many Black people who do use the labor contracts because they have labor which is coveted by not just the South but the North as well, and because their labor is considered cheaper, you're going to see these contracts and how people are going to gain from them. So, an example on the left, you see a contract. I wish I did not screenshot these because like I can't make them bigger. But you're going to see people get actual a cash money that their labor is that they're going to be paid in money, um, in cash money. Then on the one on the right, you're going to see people being paid in corn, in pork, hundreds of pounds of pork, corn by the uh, bushels. Then we have to then ask ourselves, what are they doing with this excess? Because you look at, they have their children, they have their spouses, in some cases, it may be aunts, uncles, mothers, dads, etc., that they have to uh, take care of. However, though, let's look at it. Whatever is the excess, they take that to market and they make cash money off of it. So by looking at these labor contracts, we have to also understand that many of these individuals really understand business because they lived under a system where they were traded as property and pawns. Therefore, that understanding carries over. And looking at, this isn't a contract with just one person making money. These are groups of people. A lot of times they are related to each other. They could be brothers, cousins, etc. They're going to pool that money together. And for people who do not have labor contracts, they went to work to help themselves. They were barbers, they were laundresses, mechanics, carpenters, brick masons, farmers, etc. That they understood how to make money, and that is something that cannot be like overlooked, and that does move beyond the traditional period of Reconstruction. All about the Benjamins, as I call, what Mississippi Zion also does is uses a lot of imagery. It's important that we see these people. It's important that we connect them and not just look at them as one gigantic group without any names, any identities, any stories. So these are just some examples of some of the people who lived in the county, and these were their occupations: cooks, merchants, um, those who cut hair, newspaper editors, etc. It's a range of job occupations, not just sharecroppers, not just people who didn't own anything, but people who went about trying to make their own money. And so that way that they could have far more leverage over their life. And utilizing the census records and going through them painstakingly, page by page. Thankfully, these are online and not having to do it by hand. Counting up every household and everybody who reported that they had money or wealth. You see that Attala County and these are the other counties in the region that are that 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 are nearby Attala, uh, and touch Attala County. We're looking less than 5 years after slavery, really before the heart of the Bureau really takes place. You have Black people accumulating a lot of money and wealth. So these numbers that they are reporting, black people are saying, this is how much I have. I have $200, $10, $5. You add that up, then tracing that back to the labor contracts, now we can now begin to weave this understanding of, okay, if black people have money, they had to have made that money somehow. So these labor contracts now carry a bit more weight in how black people utilize their labor to make money. Um, and also looking at like what percentage of the population was black. You do have some majority black counties in this region, such as Holmes County, as you see, that has a sizable amount of wealth, as do a few more. But few years after slavery, you see black people accumulating wealth and breaking down the county itself, Attala County itself, by its beats and other ranges that like it does have. You get to see the number of people that held wealth, how much wealth that they had, that how much they had as a collective. Then you get to see in terms of that part of the county, or to the back, the percentage of the money in the county, how much of that was held by black hands, by black people. Um, Beat four would be your majority black area of the county, and that's where you see a lot of the wealth and a far more sizable amount of the wealth in that part of the that sizable amount of wealth in terms of the county itself. Again, going page by page, counting up household by household, you see the accumulation of wealth, one within the broader region of the state, but also to breaking it down within the county itself. Now, what do you do with that money? You begin to buy land. Land was liberation. It afforded you some space to segregate yourself from the broader society, more control over your labor, your leisure, um, this notion of owning something as opposed to being owned. Um, and going through the land records, in reading different works on the South, the a typical storyline would be, oh well, black people couldn't buy land because whites wouldn't agree to work with them, and or that black people could only buy land that wasn't very good, that they didn't get good deals on their land. Well, the examples utilized are not very good because that's a generalization that really lacks a lot of research. So when looking at the land records, and this is the 1870s, during historical reconstruction and post, uh, looking at the number of acres that black people are buying, it's important to note the ultimate color is green. And people, and yes, there are people who chose to choke on their hate and starve on their hate. But there are many people, hey, you got money, I got land, I need money, I want to sell. All it takes is one person to sell you land. It does not take a whole race to sell you land. Uh, so looking at some of the people and looking at the acreage of land that they bought, but then looking at the money that they paid and looking at these land transactions, and as someone who just recently bought land, when the land deed says cash in hand, it means cash in hand. Handing over cash for land, no, the records do not say, "Oh, you will work for me for 10 years and you will get a share of the crop for X amount." No, cash in hand. $800, $800, $235, $590. Look, 2,300, 7,500. I mean, I had to kind of stop right there for a second and no, because that's a large amount of money in that time period. But I cannot use presentism and say, well, just because I don't think it was plausible today doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Um, but also we're also looking at one name on the land deed, but this, if we go back to the labor contracts, where we're looking at where this money is coming from, it may be under one name, but these are brothers coming together, sisters coming together, mothers, father. People are taking their money and pulling it together to be able to buy this land, and not just 1 acre, not just 2 acres, but hundreds of acres. And for many of these, this land still exists today under these names. And therefore, you're seeing Black activity, Black mobility, and it's through their own efforts and not necessarily someone is giving them something, because technically after slavery, black no black people were not given anything. There was this idea that everyone's going to get X amount of acres and a meal, but that never came to light. Nor were Black people just going to sit around and wait on the same government that had enslaved them to now give them something. So you're seeing Black agency, and not just agency as, oh yeah, Black people had agency, but you're literally seeing what they were doing with their time. And again, with photographs, these are some pictures of the landowners. You see on the left, this was Robert Burt. His name is here. There is Schroeder Nash Sr., Isham Kern, Thomas Jameson Sr. And look when they were born. No, in the 1820s, 40s. You're talking about men, some men who had spent over a quarter of a century as slaves, and a few years, less than 10 years or so after slavery, they have the money to buy land. And just considering that they were once considered property who was worth money, now they're able to make money and to buy land from it. Also, the in terms of the pictures also indicate signs of disposable income, uh, like economic comfort to take photographs, because a picture is not cheap. And if you're trying to save money and be frugal and be thrifty so that you can buy and purchase and invest, a photograph is, or it can be viewed as leisurely. And looking also at these men, you're not seeing men who look so light that they can be interpreted as white. This is not the mulatto elite. These are everyday people, and in terms of their dress, it's not all coveralls and looking all worn down and haggard, and in front of some in front of a log cabin that's lopsided, etc. Reframing the narrative of looking at Black people as capitalist, or understanding how to play that game to move up in society. Now, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper here. We're talking about, now this is post Reconstruction. The North is no longer in the South. And now this is the era of the Nadir, where now we're recapitulating back to white supremacy, and Black people are about to undergo this drastic change prior to Jim Crow. Well, what are Black people actually doing? Okay, so and you're making that money, you're buying that land. Now we're going to see let's dig a little bit deeper. The 1880 census. And the thing with census records is that you do have to really examine them and to really look at also how they change over time, how they are written, reported, etc. 1880 census, if you look on your left, and again, screenshotting may not be the best way to present sometimes, but if we look down here at George Adams and his wife Harriet, this is George and this is Harriet. Harriet is a Black woman. She just looks white. But in their household, they have a housekeeper. This housekeeper lives in their household, and they also have a servant. They have 3 children. And I argued that this woman who was a maid, and previously, before living with George and Harriet, she was a maid for a well-to-do judge, Judge Young. Judge Young was he was the man who gave the land for what became the uh, so like he gave the land for what became the school that black children went to. So a black couple who has a white woman living in their household as a housekeeper. Why is she there? How does she get there? Is it illegal for her to be there? How does this shape our notions of the color line? Now, like a Michael Ayers would say that the 1880s, that the a color line hadn't really been, it wasn't in cement yet, and there was a lot of fluidity. Well, having a white woman work for you and being recorded in your household with not just one black man, but two black men in terms of the servant, and she's not an older black woman. She's still a younger black woman who could, a younger white woman who could still like have children. So I present a lot of questions, um, uh, what are some plausible ways how we can explain this white woman in this black household? And this is where my department had a field day at UMass. They came, no, they had some very interesting ways of trying to place this woman in this black home. But what I settled on was, why not? There is no law that says that white women cannot work in black households as maids. We don't question when black women work in white households as maids. And the interesting part of this was how sometimes the discourse is, oh, well, we never talk about the black maid and who her family was. Well, in this case, nobody cared about George and Harriet Adams. They were only interested in in this white maid and this housekeeper. So I said, connecting it back to people making money and economics, in this same area of the county, which is known as Blackjack, which is this all black enclave inside of a broader uh, uh, like all black space, you had a black man named uh, Hesley Adams, and he had a black butler, Charlie Bullock. Then you had a man named Nicholas Nicholas uh, uh, name is skipping me, Macklemore. He had two black maids. So how we like to keep up with the Joneses. If we see someone who buys a house, we want to buy a better house or drive a nicer car. Let's think of black people as competing with each other, like who can one up each other, because that still happens today. So why not happen then? So someone says, "Hey, I have a black butler." The next person say, "Hey, I have two black maids." George Adams say, "Hey, guess what? I have a maid and a butler, and my maid is white." And guess what? The Ku Klux Klan does not come after them. George lives into the 20s. Harriet dies in 1940. This this showcases and indicates that the power to hire, and then also hiring a white woman, one could interpret as they don't want their children to only see black women as being maids, as people that work. That's in other homes and households. So what Mississippi Zion does is forces us to really re-examine what is happening on the ground level. And the power of money to now influence politics is that the power of money does allow you to, in a way, subvert the expectations of this color line, whether it's in cement or not. You're really challenging one of the biggest concerns of the time, which is black men and white women. Um, Now, while it's the only case I have found, I call it the curious case of Betty Howard. I'm not saying that every black home had a white maid in it, but we can't discount, especially if we're now studying one location over time, and now we're able to put this into broader context. We have one is making money as power too in this time period. We have land, we have what people are doing with this money, but also the greatest part of liberation is going to school and education. No education was just like being a slave. Attala County is going to at one point have two colleges that are run by black people, black entities, two colleges in one county, two black colleges in one county where there are no white colleges. Several black schools in the county. Teachers, both men and women, understanding that black people wanted to educate their own children. While they were while understanding that integration was on the table at one point within the broader state history during the time that the state is trying to rewrite its or write a new uh, constitution. Many black people wanted black schools and they wanted black teachers, and because they wanted their children to be educated in a certain way that was not going to have the next group of leaders um, in their race think of themselves as less than. So, looking at education and looking at the significance of it, Attala County is no different, but it is one of the few counties in the state to have a black college, and it's even one of the fewer counties to have two black colleges within its county. So broader, what we're seeing is over time, while the state of Mississippi is a state with more black people in it, the number of black children who are attending schools is going to be more than the number of white children who are attending schools. That becomes a very interesting occurrence that's happening because for many black homes, you had to go to school to move up in life. Education amongst white homes was not viewed as important because education had more so been associated with something that the elite did. Those with money went to school, whereas poorer people had to work in the farms, you needed that labor. Your children were labor sources, and therefore not necessarily sending them to school. But we're seeing though a lot of black children, or the number of black children is going to outnumber the number of white children who are going to school. This is where now are going to see the changes, or what is the result of this power of black people. And moving well into the 1880s, black enrollment and white enrollment of children, you're going to see black enrollment is still going to trump that of white enrollment. And the and these numbers were taken from 1885. The very next year in 1886, the state of Mississippi begins to regulate schools in the state. First and foremost, children had to go to school. Um, Now you also have teachers have to take examinations, which on their face there's something wrong with someone having to showcase that they are skilled to do so. But when the rules get manipulated where black teachers are going to be scored harder and thus lower than white teachers, and they're going to be paid lower than white teachers, now becomes where you're seeing the impact of the power, because of education, you cannot have the next generation of black children being more educated than white children. So now you have to manipulate the system to give the leg up to white children. Also, you're going to now give more state funds to white schools than you are black schools. Within all of that, in Attala County, you still get black men who make as much as white men, or make as much or more than white male teachers and white women teachers. And this becomes a big issue of the times in the election of 1895, 96 is where this equality in pay is first raised, and the superintendent of education, who does approve it, goes on the record to say, "Oh well, he never approved these salaries," but in fact he did. But what you are seeing is black people are continuing to do what they need to do. You're seeing the laws now beginning to change around them, to which it's going to eventually completely catch up, but they're driving the law. The law isn't driving them, they're driving the laws that are being made. And pictures of the educators. John Wesley Bain began teaching at age 16, I believe. Lee Turner, he taught college. Um, Valina Cooper was highly educated. Charles McMichael, he created like his own school where he was able to teach a lot of young black children and grown black men and women. And then wrapping up with voting is power, or almost wrapping up with voting is power, by 1890, the influence of black people is going to be targeted, meaning that most states in the South do not want black people to influence elections. And like as history does accurately uh, project, depict, that these state constitutions were deliberately created to remove black people from voting. Where the mistake is made is assuming that black people could not read or write or did not have money. So the early or the laws that are passed in terms of the literacy test, poll tax, understanding clause, when when like in Mississippi, those laws went into effect in 1892 at the start of the year. What Even those who were in Congress at the time in Mississippi even said that these laws were not going to stop black people, because Thomas Guyton, who was of this county, he knew that black people had obtained a lot of land, that they had a lot of money, that 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 they were going to school, and he argued before Congress during the convention, this is not going to work. And as we see here with voting, the number of new, or because really it's new in the entire state, but the number of black people who are getting their names on the books, it's not just one or two. It's not just those that white people will say, oh yes, this is a person with good character and I vouch for them. Because black people could read and understand, and in this county, the percentage of black men who could read and write was 89%, and only 3% could not read or write. That's saying a lot about how seriously black people took going to school and learning how to read. But the number of people who continuously add their names to the poll books and the registration books, hundreds of black men, not just a few, and the number of black people who vote also show that that one, that they are like engaged, that they have the money, that they are able to meet these thresholds that are created to deliberately um, remove them from voting, that they're able to meet this threshold. But because Black people continuously insist on voting, that's going to drive a reaction. And because they continue to vote after a reaction has already been created, then by 1902 is where now you get the whole idea of the white pride system, where now you're going to, in a sense, select the winner of the election before the general election, privatize a party, and then restrict that party to only white people, because no matter how educated and how much money you have, Black people cannot turn themselves white. That's the impact of Black power on politics. Um, um, but even in regards to voting, white individuals had kind of raised the alarm that this wasn't going to work. Pictures of the enfranchised. One thing that I think it's Leon Litwack in Trouble in Mind. He talks about how Jim Crow is going, well, how Jim Crow baptized Black people, young Black people, into society. No, Black men and women, mothers and fathers, grandfathers, they are going to be the ones who are going to show their children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews what society could be. And when you look in the poll books, someone like a Robert Gladney, his father, who was also enslaved, born in 1820, when to see that they go to put their names into the books on the same day, that's generational. That's a man born in 1820 and his son who's born in slavery, and also he had another son born shortly after slavery. On the same day, they're able to put their names in the books. That's showcasing the next group of Black people what your power is, what you can do. It's not necessarily Jim Crow is going to tell Black people what they can and cannot do. It's Black people who are telling their children what they can and cannot do. And the apex of all of this power comes in 1900, the census incident. Two men are going to be appointed as head of the census, running the census, enumerators. The townspeople of Beat 3 and Beat 4. Beat 3 is predominantly white, Beat 4 is predominantly Black. But they're going to write to DC, their senator in DC, and demand, if this appointment is not withdrawn or withheld, all you know what is going to break loose. And I just remembered that we're being uh, recorded. But they threatened to lynch these two men, who are both college educated men. They are teachers. One is a minister, and they refuse to step down. They have earned this right. In a sense, they had played the game and they had earned the rights. And President McKinley withdrew the appointment. President McKinley withdrew the appointment. Let's say that again. President McKinley withdrew the appointment. And therefore, now you're seeing, if you can't beat them, kill them. You know, this targeting of powerful Black people, which is going to be first really exposed by Wales in like her writings in Memphis, but you're seeing the impact of Black power on politics, is that this notion of killing successful Black people is because their success is leading to them getting into spaces that people were not prepared for them to be in, because Black people had subverted any expectation, because they weren't thinking about the broader society. They were thinking about themselves and what they needed to do, and they were doing it. And now you're seeing now what's catching up to them. So the broader Jim Crow society is going to grow in response to their movement, because now you have to contain these individuals because you don't contain or you don't fear people who don't have power, or you don't fear people that you don't think is a threat to you. And therefore, this notion of Black power has an influence on politics, white politics. And the 20th century story, we now will be looking at the Black response to Jim Crow, which in a sense is a response to Black power. And then what's the result of that as we kind of get over this? Now we're in the 20th century and the color line is established, etc. Well, there's a couple of things to look at. One, I will start on the right. By 1912-13, you see a dramatic disparity in the spending on white education and Black education, but now we know the roots of that. In terms of voting, you're going to see Black men in this county. The vote is going to drastically drop off in terms of new people who are going to put their names in the books, and even those who are actually going to vote. Now, are these men technically, have they lost the right to vote? No. Their impact or their influence is severely eliminated. But though the newspapers every year are going to publish people who have not paid their poll taxes. Now let's think about the poll tax, and the money from the poll tax goes to fund schools and education. Well, if counties and states are not going to fund education equally, then why would Black people vote? Why would Black people give their money to pay for white education? So when we're looking at Black people not voting, let's also look at the logistically, or let's look at the logistics and the common sense part of it. Would you give your money to something that doesn't help either you, your community, your children? And how else can you protest these new laws in terms of voting? By now, you're going to withhold your money, and you're going to give that money directly to your community. It could be your school, your church, whomever it is, as opposed to giving it to the county and the state, who's just going to give it back to white schools and white children. So what Mississippi Zion does ask people to do is re-examine historical agency and re-examine this era of liberation that Black people continue to be on, and what is the impact of their efforts to be truly liberated. And that is the end of my presentation, and I will stop sharing and come back to everybody else.
Thank you,
And I
Doctor.
think I did that in 1 hour, as promised.
Perfect. Fascinating research, Dr. Ashford. I'm reminded of a few things. First of all, that the South is not one place, and that even a part of the South, if you take Mississippi, is not one place.
Yes.
This is very apparent in this research. And also, I'm very struck by your argument that we flip the story in a sense, that we look at the rise of Jim Crow, the backlash against the most ambitious phases of Reconstruction, that we look at that thing that you're calling Black Power at that time. It's Jim Crow is the reaction to Black Power, not Black Power the reaction to Jim Crow.
Yes.
Yeah.
The 20th century Black Power is the reaction to Jim Crow. So by moving Black Power back 100 years,
yeah,
to a literal thing and not just a concept, we're seeing what Jim Crow is responding to, or what I argue that it's responding to, as opposed to the 20th century Black Power, which is the response to Jim Crow.
Yeah, this is wonderful, illuminating research. We have a few people who've hung out with us. Any questions that anyone would like to pose for Dr. Ashford? Kevin, go ahead. Let me spotlight you here so we can see you. And
wow, exciting.
There we are.
Yeah, thanks. This was terrific. That's so interesting. And it's making me rethink all the stuff I read a long time ago in grad school. But I'm gonna ask the case study question. So I'm curious about the particular dynamics of this county and this community that you're looking at, which you described as sort of race neutral, which
Yes.
as you're defining it, it's not a black majority, it's not a white majority. It's a mix of black and white folks in the community, and so I'm wondering like the kind of dynamics, the kind of power that you're seeing African Americans able to exercise in that community. To what extent is that power broadly defined a function of the demographics? And the traditional scholarship, were they just looking in the wrong places? Were they looking in communities where it's majority white, and then so of course the minority small black population in those necessarily have less power, and so that kind of demographic has dictated the traditional narrative. So
Yes.
is this a peculiar community that just had this possibility, or is this more generalized across demographics?
In Mississippi, you have either or, as you just said. You have counties with such a small black population that any activity is not going to be deemed any threat to anything. Most histories of the South are going to look at majority black counties where there's already a heightened response of white individuals because they are the minority. Attala County, in terms of at least like Mississippi, is going to be more one of the more unique counties once you dive into the numbers. It's not the Mississippi Delta, where that's majority black. And I think there's a book by John Willis where he does talk about how the Mississippi Delta at one point black people owned the majority of the land, and by 1900, so the imagery that we get of the Mississippi Delta of black people being poor and they're working on the lands of whites show no, that would be why people want to study a black majority county, because um, for many there's just more there. Attala County, I think, is a bit more less normal, but I do think that every state should redo a county history and dig down into those numbers just to say. Um, but Attala was chosen because looking at the numbers, it's either heavily black or heavily white. And it really being in the center of the state and having this more so of a race neutral county, um, uh, I think it made, in terms of politics, people had to be a bit more cagey and savvy. Now you had to look at who's Republican, who's a Democrat. Now, what other things are going to constitute power other than race? And really, up through the end of Reconstruction, the county is Republican. So, that's another area to look at, that you're not just going to choose people off of race. Now you have to look at how do you make your numbers even more um, powerful without being able to rely solely on a white majority or a black majority. Also, you had a number of whites in the county that are actually Northerners too, such as Jason Niles. You have people who are very influential in politics who are not from the South. He's from Vermont. You have New Yorkers. You have such as Judge Young, even though he owns some slaves. Sam Young owns slaves. He's also a New Yorker as well. So you also have a different mindset in this county that's just not traditionally Southern.
Excellent question. The texture of these different places, it's very rich with, as you say so well, digging into the specificity of the different places. Dr. Stapleton, did you have a question? Go ahead. Let me
Yeah, so
bring you
I,
up
I have
here.
to leave at 6:30, but thanks very much. It was a very interesting talk, and um my own field is Chinese history, so I don't know a whole lot about this, except I have a colleague Carol Emberton, who also writes about this period, not about Mississippi, but she, well, her first book has something to do with, I mean, covers the South more broadly, and she points to the violence and the use of guns and the training on guns that Black people gained. And it made me wonder how that fits into your story, whether, I mean, when you think about power, your definition is very broad, and then somebody might think, yeah, could they have guns? And do they want them? And to what extent did people prepare for what eventually came? They might not have known that things were going to be so bad, but so that was one question. And then the other is her more recent book is called, so as department chair, I have to read everybody's book. But in this case, a wonderful book called To Walk About in Freedom, The Long Emancipation of Priscilla Joyner. And this is a story that's focused more on Virginia, North Carolina. And it's about a woman who, for her understanding of emancipation and her community's understanding of it, had a lot more to do with like the ability to move. And so she looks at this a lot. And you pointed to this in your last point where, there were actually people coming down from the north to settle in this community. That would change a lot of things because it would give you a different perspective, right? So if you have anything more to say about mobility and maybe particularly gender, because frequently people say cities are great liberators of women because they're able to get outside the family and find their own source of income and that sort of thing. So just some thoughts that you might want to respond to. Thank you.
Oh yes, no problem. Good questions. In terms of guns, actually, 1872, there's a black man named Peter Williams. He's part of a loyal league or a union league. And he rides through town on his horse saying, no, um, he's no, he's black, he's free, no one's going to take away his rights. And he has like his open arms and guns going back even earlier than that, 1865. Judge Niles has a diary, and like he writes about a group of black men with guns who go to recoup their cotton that had been stolen, and they march through town with their guns to the meal so that people know not to mess with them. Um, uh, Black people owned guns. There's the story of uh, name escapes me, but he was accosted by a white sheriff for allegedly touching a white woman, and the white sheriff tries to place him under, uh, I think, arrest, and the black guy shoots him and goes on the run. There's a huge manhunt that's launched to bring him back to justice. Black people will shoot if they have to shoot. There is an understanding though that they do have to be careful in how they are going to be depicted and portrayed, because they're trying to also walk a fine line in trying to showcase that all they want to do is be a citizen. The first time someone shoots, the whole race gets deemed as being harsh and dangerous, and that you need people to come in with their guns and put them down. So what you do see is that in the cases where black people are killed, the response is not always yay white people, that there's actually people who are going to condemn these actions, because the last thing the South wants is the North to intervene in their life. So there are efforts to curtail lynching by constructing laws that says that the county has to give money to the victims of lynching if they do not put those who did the lynching in jail, because the South was also they want to attract stores and businesses are not going to want to be in a place where lynching is the Wild West out there, but Black people will use guns and fight back. There are more overt examples, and then there are some where we have to put ourselves in the, like in their shoes, to say, they protected themselves more often than not. The Ku Klux Klan and the other groups were there. So the fact that a lot of people did what they did without being lynched, one kind of has to paint the picture that they were probably like heavily armed, even if no, and it didn't have to come to that, to where it was in newspapers or written down in um, like in diaries and or like other sources. In terms of gender, the book really does highlight women uh, as a lot of the drivers of this, especially in terms of economics. Um, um, Looking at, I think by 1910, there's a woman who tries to launch a boycott against like white employers. So she's a domestic and she's trying to bring on other cooks, people who do laundry, etc., to not work for white people until they get paid more money. Her her efforts actually bring in county that police to actually go into a church and to try to get the preacher and others in the church to give up this woman, or to say is the church the source of her of like of her boycott. So the fact that there's a separation of church and state, but you have the state coming into the church to get information on this woman who's leading or trying to lead this overall uh, boycott against white individuals. But she was an educated person too. So a lot of looking at laundresses, cooks who actually own their own businesses and work on their own account. They don't just work in other other homes. Looking at the number of black women who are teachers, those looking at so really either you were a teacher or you owned your own business. Um, like you were a merchant, etc. But also, when we're looking at the land owning and the voting, black women also work. So, is there dollars to that though that's going into these land transactions? Is there dollars too that are allowing the black men to go and do the poll tax? So it's not saying that women were just doing nothing but in the household and just cooking, but their labor and their work contributes to what people are doing, even though like on record we only see black men's names. Um, uh, in terms of movement, by 1914-15, as the migration begins to take place, I think as now you're seeing the response to Black Power, now you're seeing the movement of people as this is the next wave of being free, not staying in a place where we have seen our rights be stripped from us. So I do see liberation being connected to movement. We have a scholar here, Dr. Soren. She wrote the book Driving While Black. And so that talks about how cars and automobiles represent freedom, movement out of oppression and things of that nature, but also the response to that movement, driving while black. So black people leaving the South, that was a loss of labor. And there are even stories of trying to keep black people in the South because you covet their labor. So this whole notion of movement being equated to being free, I completely agree with that, because at the end of the day, people may not like black people as people, but you do covet their labor. And if they're moving, you have to find ways to restrict that movement.
Fascinating questions. Well, I'm really struck, Dr. Ashford, just that this book is about agency also. This is a
Yes.
book about foregrounding the agency of African Americans in the history of Mississippi, in the history of capitalism
Yes.
in the history of the South, in the history of the United States after the Civil War, up through into the 20th century. So I'm adding it to my shelf alongside
Oh, thank you.
alongside other scholarship that's been done in this area. You know, I think of Charles Payne's work. I think of Stephen Hahn's recent work on this, and you know, really rethinking the story by, as you're doing, recentering the agency of those who wanted to make a life for themselves in this place, coming out of the Civil War and out of the end of slavery. So, so I really thank you for this presentation, this excellent research, and just a reminder to spread far and wide that our next webinar will be March 12th with Sheila Bernard, speaking about another person who kind of came out of this milieu, we could say, Hadi Ledbetter, someone who she wants to also place at the center of the story and give agency, I think, in her new research. So we have a theme for our spring courses.
Which I'll just add and conclude with. We often talk about agency and wanting to give people agency, but then going back to the quote by Du Bois, are we ready though for the agency that we want people to have if it shifts the narrative? Or while the book was received with these awards and nominations, which I was completely flattered by and shocked by, it was, to my opinion, are we still being recorded?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I do feel, I won't say it was, I do feel it was shunned by the larger associations like the AHA, the Southern Historical Association, the OAH, Organization of American Historians. I do believe that it was snubbed, or because it does challenge Stephen Hahn, it does challenge Eric Foner. Directly, not just in the footnotes, kind of thing. And so I do think that it has its audience, but I do think it was shunned by some of the larger organizations, so to say. So, but now that they have my thoughts on the record, so not that they haven't gotten already via email.
It goes to your point that we perhaps still have a lot to learn from Du Bois.
Yes.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for having me. I have enjoyed myself.
We're delighted to put this into the mix of the larger historiography, and I hope, as the book percolates around, that there will be more engagement with these debates about the people who made the history, and also about how we understand and frame this really crucial story more broadly. So we're glad to showcase the work here and
thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And bring it into the conversation.
And the photographs were wonderful. Yes. Thank you so much.
That took 20 years of collecting pictures, and they so happen to be useful.
Powerful images. So thank you again, Dr. Ashford, and thanks to Dr. Sheets, Dr. Stapleton for your questions. And we shall reconvene here in a couple of weeks on March 12th. So everyone have a wonderful night and take care and stay in touch.
Okay, thank you very much. Y'all have a great one.
Bye-bye.